There's a story that circulates in certain corners of the internet. It goes like this. In 1891, a mining crew in Montana allegedly pulled a hammer out of the earth. The head, according to the tale, weighed somewhere around 800 pounds. The handle supposedly measured close to 20 feet long. Now, I want to be clear from the start. I can't verify this. No one can. But the story persists, and it's not alone. The account claims that a foreman named Elias Thorne photographed his crew standing next to it. 14 men, the story goes, and the hammerhead came up to their shoulders. What supposedly happened next is where it gets interesting. According to family legend, passed down through generations of Thornes, the Smithsonian responded to his report with a strange instruction: destroy the object, preserve no photographs, discuss this with no one. Did this happen? I honestly don't know. The photograph that allegedly proves it has never been independently verified. The letter that supposedly came from the Smithsonian could be a family fabrication. The whole thing could be an elaborate hoax passed down through 4 generations. But here's what I find fascinating. This isn't the only story like this. Not even close. Part 1. The rumors let me share some of the other accounts that researchers have collected over the years. And I want to emphasize, these are accounts, stories, claims that may or may not have any basis in reality. There's supposedly a report from 1869 about coal miners in Pennsylvania who unearthed an iron pickaxe of unusual size. The details vary depending on who's telling it. Some say the head weighed 300 pounds, others say more. The handle length changes too. That's often a sign of folklore rather than fact. Another story places a discovery in Ohio around 1877. Railroad workers, the tale goes, found a cache of what they described as oversized farming implements. Again, no verified photographs, no museum, specimens, just stories that have circulated through alternative history communities for decades. There's a particularly dramatic account from Texas in 1883. A well-digging crew supposedly broke through into an underground chamber containing what witnesses described as a giant's workshop. The local newspaper editor allegedly photographed everything before county officials arrived and ordered it destroyed. Allegedly, supposedly. The tale goes. I keep using these words because I have to. None of this is proven. The newspaper archives from that period are incomplete, which believers point to as evidence of cover-up and skeptics point to as simply incomplete archives. Both interpretations are possible. What I find genuinely interesting isn't whether any individual story is true. It's the pattern. Before of part 2, the pattern question. Here's what strikes me about these accounts. They come from different times, different places, different sources. They weren't collected by a single researcher pushing a single agenda. They emerged independently, often decades apart, often from people who had no contact with each other, and yet they share common elements. The objects are always tools, practical implements, not ceremonial items. The scale is consistently in the same range, suggesting users roughly 30 to 45 feet tall, if you do the math. The response from authorities, in every story, follows the same sequence: confiscation, destruction, silence. Now, this pattern could mean several things. It could mean there's truth to the accounts, some genuine phenomenon that was repeatedly discovered and repeatedly suppressed. Or it could mean these stories share a common folklore source. One original tale that spawned variations, each adapted to local settings and time periods. This happens all the time with urban legends. Or, and this is worth considering, it could mean that people who find unusual objects tend to interpret them through similar, cultural lenses. If you grew up hearing Bible stories about giants, you might be primed to see giant tools, where a more skeptical observer would see, I don't know, unusual geological formations, or industrial equipment from a forgotten enterprise. I genuinely don't know which explanation is correct, but I think the question is worth exploring. Part 3. The Smithsonian question. One element that appears in many of these accounts is the Smithsonian institution. Story after story describes objects being sent to the Smithsonian and then disappearing, or the Smithsonian sending representatives who confiscate discoveries, or the Smithsonian actively instructing people to destroy evidence. Is any of this true? The Smithsonian, for its part, has repeatedly denied these claims. They say they have no record of giant bones or oversized tools. They say the stories are fabrications or misunderstandings. And honestly, that could be true. But there's a book I should mention. In 1987, a woman named Margaret Chen, who claimed to have worked as a Smithsonian archivist for 31 years, allegedly published a small press volume called The Forbidden Collection. I say allegedly because I haven't been able to verify Chen's employment, and the book itself is extremely rare. Most of what we know about it comes from people who claim to have read it. According to these accounts, Chen described restricted storage areas containing objects that were never displayed or studied, including supposedly photographs of oversized tools and skeletal fragments of unusual size. The book was apparently suppressed. Chen was supposedly sued. Her papers were allegedly purchased by an anonymous buyer after her death. This could all be true. It could all be an elaborate hoax. It could be a mix. A real person whose claims were exaggerated by others over time. What I can tell you is that the Chen story has become part of the larger mythology around this topic. Whether it's evidence or folklore, I'll leave for you to decide. Part 4. The Tartarian Theory. Now, some researchers have tried to connect these tool discoveries to a larger theory. You may have heard of Tartaria. The Tartarian hypothesis, and I want to stress that this is a hypothesis, not established fact, suggests that before our current recorded history, there existed a global civilization of unusual advancement. This civilization, according to the theory, included beings of different sizes working together. The giants in this framework aren't monsters. They're called champions, partners in a symbiotic society where different types of beings contributed different capabilities. It's a fascinating idea. It would explain a lot of anomalies that mainstream archaeology struggles with. The megalithic structures, the precision stonework, the buildings that seem impossible for their supposed era. But I have to be honest, there's no hard evidence for Tartaria. It's a theory built on anomalies and gaps in the historical record. Believers see those gaps as evidence of deliberate erasure. Skeptics see them as simply gaps, missing information that proves nothing. The giant tools, if they exist, could support the Tartarian theory. Or they could be something else entirely. Or they could be folklore that reflects human psychology rather than historical fact. I find the theory compelling as a thought experiment, but I can't tell you it's true. Part 5. What the skeptics say. In the interest of fairness, let me present the skeptical position. Skeptics argue that giant tool stories are a form of folklore that emerged in 19th century America, when the country was rapidly expanding and people were frequently encountering unfamiliar objects in the ground. A large piece of industrial equipment, abandoned by a failed mining operation, might look like a giant's tool to workers who don't know its origin. Unusual geological formations can resemble manufactured objects. Human memory is unreliable, and stories grow in the telling. The Smithsonian conspiracy, skeptics say, is a convenient explanation for why no physical evidence exists. If every piece of evidence was destroyed by the Smithsonian, then believers never have to produce actual proof. The conspiracy becomes unfalsifiable. These are fair points. I also think it's worth noting that the late 19th century was a time of considerable fraud in American archaeology. Fake giants were manufactured and exhibited for profit. Hoaxes were common. Some of the giant stories from this era have been definitively debunked. So there's legitimate reason for skepticism. The question is whether healthy skepticism should lead us to dismiss all of these accounts, or whether some of them might point to something genuinely unexplained. Part 6. The modern accounts. Here's where it gets more interesting to me. The stories didn't stop in the early 20th century. There are accounts, again unverified, from more recent decades. A construction crew in Denver in 1976, miners in West Virginia in 1988, an archaeological survey in New Mexico in 2004 that was allegedly classified. In 2019, a video circulated briefly on social media that appeared to show construction workers in Detroit standing next to an unusually large iron object emerging from an excavation. The video was removed from major platforms, which believers cite as evidence of ongoing suppression and skeptics cite as routine content moderation. I've seen the video. Or rather, I've seen copies of copies, degraded through multiple screenshots and re-uploads. It's not clear enough to draw conclusions. The object could be a giant tool. It could be a piece of industrial equipment. It could be a deliberate hoax. What I can say is that people are still reporting these discoveries. Whether that means the phenomenon is real and ongoing, or whether it means the folklore is alive and generating new variations, I can't say. Part 7. The unanswerable questions. Let me share what genuinely puzzles me about this topic. If the stories are all false, just folklore and hoaxes, why do they persist? Why do they keep emerging from independent sources? Why hasn't the pattern died out? But if the stories are true, if giant tools really were found and systematically destroyed, how has the secret been kept? Conspiracies involving thousands of people across more than a century should leak. Where are the deathbed confessions from Smithsonian employees? Where are the objects that slip through the cracks? The Thorn photograph, if real, would be exactly such a leak. But we can't verify it's real. The Chen book, if accurate, would be exactly such a confession. But we can't verify it's accurate. We're left with stories, compelling stories, strange stories, stories that fit together in suggestive ways. But stories aren't proof. I think the honest position is uncertainty. Something might be going on here, or nothing might be going on here. The evidence we have is tantalizing, but not conclusive. Part 8. Why it matters, or doesn't. You might ask, even if some of this were true, why would it matter? For believers, the implications are enormous. If giants existed, our entire understanding of human history is wrong. If a previous civilization was deliberately erased, we're living in a constructed reality, a false narrative maintained by powerful institutions. That's a big claim, and big claims require big evidence. For skeptics, these stories matter for a different reason. They reveal something about human psychology, our pattern-seeking nature, our distrust of authority, our hunger for hidden knowledge. The giant tool stories might be more interesting as folklore than they would be as fact. I think both perspectives have merit. If I had to guess, and it's only a guess, I'd say the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Some unusual objects were probably found during the Great Expansion era. Some of them were probably misidentified. Some reports were probably exaggerated. And maybe, possibly, a few genuine anomalies were dismissed or overlooked by institutions that didn't know what to make of them. That's a less dramatic conclusion than giants walked the earth and were genocided, but it might be closer to reality. Part 9. The photograph. Let me return to the Thorn story one more time. Even if I can't verify it, I find it moving. The idea of a man in 1891, confronted with something that challenged everything he understood about the world, ordered to destroy the evidence, hiding one photograph in his family Bible for 52 years, never telling anyone, leaving only a note for his descendants. Someone needs to know. Whether Elias Thorn was real, whether the hammer was real, whether any of this happened, that sentiment resonates with me. The desire to preserve truth against suppression, the hope that someone, someday, will understand what you witnessed. If it's true, it's heroic. If it's fiction, it's a powerful story about the human need to believe that truth will eventually emerge. Either way, it's worth thinking about. Final thoughts. I've tried to present this topic fairly. I haven't told you giants definitely existed. I can't prove that. No one can. I haven't told you the stories are definitely false. I can't prove that either. What I've tried to do is share the accounts that have accumulated over more than a century, acknowledge the legitimate reasons for both belief and skepticism, and leave you to form your own conclusions. Maybe the giant tools are real, and one day we'll find undeniable proof. Maybe they're folklore, and what we're really studying is the human imagination. Maybe the truth is something else entirely, something none of us have considered yet. If you have information about unusual discoveries, if you've seen something that doesn't fit the official narrative, I'm interested in hearing about it. Not because I'll automatically believe you, but because these accounts, true or false, tell us something about ourselves. The story of the champions of Tartaria might be history, or it might be myth, but either way, it's a story worth knowing. Something out of place, something out of time, something that might or might not have ever existed. The search for answers continues, but so does the search for better questions. The accounts described in this documentary are unverified claims from various sources. They are presented for entertainment and discussion purposes. The existence of giant tools, Tartarian civilization, or systematic institutional cover-ups has not been established by credible evidence. Viewer discretion and critical thinking are advised. If you have information or perspectives on this topic, contact information is in the description. All viewpoints are welcome.